Hey folks, before we start, this episode contains in-depth discussions of abortion, as well as references to maternal mortality, pregnancy complications, domestic abuse, and infant mortality. If that's something you don't want to listen to, it's okay to skip this episode or put it down for later. Thanks. We don't have a good photo of Ingeborg Andreas Blundell. The best description we have is a short article in the New York Herald Tribune on April 22nd, 1960. Standing before Judge William B. Grote in Brooklyn Supreme Court in downtown Brooklyn, she was everything you'd imagine a caricature of an 81-year-old widow to be. 5'1", gray hair, glasses. Her sentence had been passed. A year in observation at a nearby private nursing home. Ingeborg was much too old for prison. "It is more than you deserve," said the stern, square-jawed man who looked down at her. Judge Grote, who normally sat at the Queen's Supreme Court, had commuted over to Kings County explicitly to oversee Ingeborg's trial. "This is no poor innocent soul who has reached an economic level causing her to do these things," said Judge Grote. "I am morally certain she is responsible for the death of at least one woman, if not others. I don't want you," as he pointed to her, "to have a chance to ply your stinking trade." Indeed, Ingeborg had been in court 20 years before on the same charge. That time, the woman had died. This time, her patient had required hospitalization, and she had again been caught. It was clear that she had performed an illegal abortion. She admitted it. Said Grote, his frustration apparent, "I am convinced she has committed many others on which she was not caught." He was absolutely right. Ingeborg Andreas Blundell was an abortionist. She was a midwife, and she had multiple degrees and nearly 50 years of experience caring for women with nowhere to go. And she didn't much care what the Honorable William B. Grote had to say about it. Hey there, everyone, and welcome to Radio Free Bay Ridge, your hyperlocal podcast focused exclusively on beautiful Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. I'm Dan.
And I'm Rachel.
And we're back in the live studio together, Rachel.
It is weird. It's new. It's unfamiliar.
It's been a little while.
It's been a hot minute.
As part of co-hosting duties, we've had a long break, I think, since the pandemic, right?
I think possibly since before the pandemic.
Yeah. I did say at one point when we started our new season that I would kind of explain why we took a pause and things like that, and I thought I'd get that out of the way in this episode. This is one that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. There were two things that kind of happened. One is I had a family member, unfortunately, get hit with a pretty severe case of COVID that caused some major medical issues, and she requires a lot of care, and that takes a lot of my time, and obviously, we don't get paid for this.
No, we do not.
We don't take advertising money. We don't take grants.
No, the only compensation we receive is the adoration of Bay Ridge progressives and a very small stipend from Patreon.
Yes, I think that Patreon is about $10 at this point. If you were a Patreon, just know that was a constant reminder in the back of my head that I really needed to get this back on the road.
And if you're not a supporter on Patreon, consider becoming a supporter on Patreon.
This is not an inexpensive thing to run with websites and all of that.
We may come up with some cool rewards.
That's more work for me.
No, I'll come up with cool rewards. It'll be like, we'll tweet at you from our Twitter or something like that.
Yeah,
we'll tag you on Instagram.
Who knows? Maybe we can shout you out at the end of the episode, professional podcasters do. So I thought we'd also start off with what we used to do, which is a little bit of In the News in Bay Ridge.
Yeah, so we're recording this on Sunday, October 13th, which means, as always, the Columbus Day / Indigenous Peoples Day debate has reared its ugly head.
Again.
And in this morning's New York Post, sorry for giving the many clicks, we learned that Justin Brannan has been ejected from the city council's Italian caucus for, God forbid, suggesting that we might be able to rename it to Italian American Heritage Day.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but was he part of the Columbus caucus or the Italian-American caucus?
Well, I liked his response when the Post went to him, and he said, the Republican Italian caucus's bylaws don't change the fact that I am Italian.
It was in their bylaws that you can't.
They rewrote their bylaws because he had been open to this in the past.
So they rewrote the bylaws just so that they could eject him.
Here we go. The lefty poll's initial Columbus Day diss in October 2023 spurred the caucus's conservative leadership to rewrite its bylaws so that members going forward must not only have some Italian ancestry, but also oppose all efforts to rename the federal holiday as a national movement to cancel the Italian explorer gained steam.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that you're not going to cancel the steam of Indigenous Peoples Day because I can't believe I have to say this over and over and over again. It feels like every Columbus Day I have to say, Indigenous people and Italian Americans shared the same holiday. When it was originally invented in the 1800s, late 1800s, Native Americans and Italians marched down Broadway together because guess what was another event that happened right before that? Wounded Knee. Native American school children and Italian Americans both marching to the square we now call Columbus Circle. It was a unified day, and it was eventually turned into an only Columbus thing. It was originally about Italians in general. They shared the day.
Well, and the part of it that's so ridiculous is it's not like Justin is saying, hey, let's cancel Columbus Day. He's literally saying, like, let's rename it to Italian American Heritage Day. Like, that's something he's open to. And let's also have an Indigenous Peoples Day, but he doesn't even say replace it. He says create another day so that we're not pitting people against each other.
And then
it's the most blasé take that I can imagine having, and these Republicans are all up in a tizzy about it.
I mean, snowflakes, right?
Every accusation is a confession by those people.
I'm not really sure what Columbus's memory is. It like a mental health support puppy kind of thing? Like, I would think that like hard laws like healthcare access improvements and all this kind of stuff, undoing the history of redlining, which affected Italians so heavily. If you go back a few episodes and listen to our live talk with Henry Stewart about how Italians were treated in Brooklyn and New York in the 1800s, like there's still things to remedy there. And Columbus has served his purpose.
But Dan, you're making the assumption that Republican members of the New York City Council care about governing, and they're really just messaging people.
Oh, boy.
It's all about the messaging. It's all about what they can whip up.
Yeah, they're experts at not actually legislating or doing anything useful. I got an Alec Brooke-Krasny card in the mail because that's coming up for the election, and it's like, I voted against these two things. And it's like, there's nothing he can actually say he got done.
No, and the things he voted against are things like funding women's reproductive health care.
Boy, that's going to be useful for this episode coming up.
Yeah.
And going back to one of the other reasons that we paused the podcast is that I discovered a woman named Ingeborg. This is right after Roe v. Wade got overturned. And I knew that there was something here in Bay Ridge that we could talk about. And I found this woman, Ingeborg, in the historical record, such that it is. And I started researching, and then the next podcast's episode script kind of slipped a little bit. And then the next one. And then the next one, I went, this is very important. No, I have to keep going. And
as anyone who knows Dan knows, when he says he's researching, he's not talking about doing a couple random internet searches. He's talking about going into archives. He's talking about finding original sources. It's always been something that's really impressed me about your thoroughness when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, this isn't the way that I wanted to do this episode. I originally really wanted it to be a long format thing about her. And eventually, a couple of months ago, I really finally realized that this is a book. That this is more than just a podcast episode. There is too much.
Hey, Henry.
Help me out, please. But it's a lot, and I couldn't possibly put it into a podcast episode. I thought about breaking it out into a 5-part blog series, of which I have the first installment written. And there's also a lot more that I have to research, including going to DC and going to the New York State archives. Unfortunately, the 1900s to the passage of Roe, there's very few historical records of abortionists, and they were very important at the time, and they were practicing. But the historical record is really bad in New York City on it.
So before we dive into that, it may be a little basic, but I think we should establish when we think about people who perform abortions today, we think about OBGYNs, we think about doctors who have training, who are doing this in, sterile hospital settings for the most part, which was not the case before Roe v. Wade.
No.
Can you talk a little bit when you say an abortionist? What does that actually mean?
Well, there were different kinds. Your unlicensed midwife, someone who very little actual medical training, but knew how to deliver a baby and also knew maybe some pills or some herbal remedies or teas or things you could do to yourself that would induce abortion. It's important to know that this was something that women could learn pretty readily throughout the 1800s because common law in the United States actually allowed abortion across the country for far longer in this country than we have banned it explicitly. Because for much of history, there was really no way of knowing whether you were pregnant or not. So one of the first ways you would know is quickening, which we largely have lost in the vocabulary, but it's when you feel the baby move, and then you know you have a baby. So before quickening, it was oftentimes, even among religious groups, not considered abortion. It would just be making a woman regular.
Your point about religion, it's a very Christian way of looking at women's health and women's rights.
Yeah.
In Judaism, it's absolutely the woman's right to end a pregnancy.
Look up the tragedy of Sadie Sachs, which brings us to your earlier question about what an abortionist was. Beyond the unlicensed midwife and folk remedy, there were also professional midwives who had a very strong tradition of medical care, and I'm specifically referring here to African American and Jewish midwives in New York City, and also that midwives in New York were licensed and professionalized. Margaret Sanger's American Birth Control League, which would grow into Planned Parenthood, for example, that relied heavily on female Jewish doctors and social workers in the 1920s. And beyond that, an abortionist could be a licensed doctor, many of whom provided care behind closed doors to people who needed it, especially wealthy white women, which we might get into, and they could pay for privacy and discretion. And almost all of these providers were providing abortions, but also that was just part of the maternity, family planning, and women's health care that they otherwise would provide, including, of course, contraceptives, which were heavily policed at the time. We are actually one of the center points of the resistance against Roe v. Wade once it was passed. It really started with a Bay Ridge senator. He represented Bay Ridge, and after Roe passed, Catholics were, of course, the main group that was opposed to this. And there were very few Protestants.
You didn't have the evangelical right at that point.
Yeah, you didn't have this coalition. And the very beginning of the religious coalition forming to overturn Roe, right after it passed, really starts in Bay Ridge, actually. And I love this group, and I think that what they do is amazing. As someone with developmental problems, autism, I am diagnosed autistic. The Guild for Exceptional Children was this senator's brainchild. It was his thing in Bay Ridge. And it's because he had a child that had developmental disabilities, and he wanted to support that child. But it also meant that this man, the senator, a Protestant, was very, very sympathetic to the Catholic viewpoint against abortion, that all children should have the right to be born, no matter how they are going to be affected medically after they were born. And he put his money where his mouth was, right? He formed the Guild, but it was the first politician in the country, elected official, who wasn't Catholic, who came out against Roe.
It's really interesting to me what you say about him having a child who was impacted with developmental issues, because there's more recently, we had a city council race in 2017 where the Republican was stridently anti-abortion because of some of his life experiences and having a premature child. And I'm not going to get into naming names at this point because it's been a few years. It's interesting how some people's personal experiences can spur them on to expanding definitions of freedom, while other people's personal experiences can spur them towards restricting individual freedoms.
Yeah. I mean, what's the first thing after Andrew Gennardis got elected? The first thing that local Republicans did was hold a rally outside his inauguration party protesting abortion, protesting Roe v. Wade. It's an important part of Bay Ridge Republican politics. They would willingly offer that up. I'm not trying to get a gotcha on that.
There's nothing. Trying to get a gotcha on local Republicans is ridiculous because they make it so easy.
They do. And now it's like they're not really walking away from it.
It's a losing issue, and it's a losing issue nationally. And you see things like, for example, Melania Trump putting out a book where she says she's always been stridently pro-abortion. And it's
absurd.
Like, lady, are you crazy?
Absurd. And I do want to give some of these people the absolute benefit of the doubt where they've gone through things that make their beliefs strong. And I understand that. You just can't put it on others because other people have experiences too. And we're going to hear about them today with Ingeborg. Ingeborg was one of those people who listened to people who needed something different. Ingeborg was a woman who experienced something different than these local Republicans have experienced. And she dedicated her life to helping people in situations like that. She was an amazing woman. She lived on 92nd Street. She doesn't really exist in the historic record until we're bringing her up. But I found her and I felt this moral responsibility to tell her story, even though I know I'm not really the best one to tell.
You're right. The guy who's willing to take 2 years to research the article and write it up into an incredible document illuminating absolutely vital history of the neighborhood is definitely not the guy to be telling this story.
I know.
How very dare.
Well, I think we should get into Ingeborg because she is the heart of this, and anything that we can say pales in comparison to what her life was. So let me start a little bit with who she was. She was born in a city above the Narrows, in a small town called Grimstad on the southern coast of Norway. She was born on an autumn day, 1878. Her father was a stonemason, and Norway at the time, you have to understand, was starting to urbanize, starting to modernize. Grimstad was a small town, but it was a shipbuilding town, and it was booming. And Norway was experiencing a population boom, and Ingeborg came from a large family. She had multiple siblings, some of which died, and that stuck with her whole life. She saw that a large family was difficult to take care of, but she loved her family, and she would continue throughout her life to go back and visit her family in Norway, except for, of course, World War II, where she wasn't able to go back. But she had a couple of traumatic experiences with death. According to the newspaper, her sister died after, quote, a hard night full of struggle. I'm pretty sure that's tuberculosis, which comes into play much later in how Ingeborg chooses to conduct her life. She wants to become a nurse. And she goes off to Oslo, the capital of Norway. Really, Norway isn't even an independent country at this point. And there's a lot of nationalist fervor in Oslo. And she does that thing where, you go to college and you get radicalized. She goes to Oslo and there are communists. She ends up going to nursing school. I've tracked her down where she lives in a nursing home, taking care of older people on site. I found that the director of his nursing home wrote into the local communist newspapers about the need for better nursing care funding among the radical left.
That's really interesting, just as an aside, because right now, one of the things happening in the Harris campaign is they're really pushing in-home nursing care being covered by Medicare. So these are issues that endure over time, and it speaks to multiple experiences in Ingeborg's story.
Yeah, she also is dealing with the rise of a medical profession, a chauvinist male medical profession. Hospitals didn't always exist. They started coming into being around her time, the 1880s, 1890s, the professionalization of medicine, that these men in coats know best, not just on surgery or things like that, but women's reproductive rights. And there is a huge population boom in Norway at the time, too. A lot of people are having kids, and it's considered both a boon and a crisis at the same time because childcare hasn't been professionalized, and they're trying to, because kids would have problems related to birth. You would have to do eye drops to get rid of blindness, and children because the kind of foods that you would be giving them, and milk would not be pasteurized. There would be diseases in milk. And there's a lot of attempts at educating mothers on how to properly care for your children. This happens in New York, too. Around the exact same time, while Ingeborg is in Norway, we start the Victory Memorial Hospital in Bay Ridge, the baby hospital. They have little carts that go around the city to be like, here, have free milk for your baby.
God, it sounds like we had more support for new parents back then than we have today.
Robert Moses gets his start around this time in the Parks Department by saying, hey, let's have baby changing stations in the parks. Like, that's how he...
What?
Yeah, that's how he got popular. That's how he got, like, all of the political power that Robert Moses wields in his later life, plowing bridges and highways. He got the goodwill with baby changing stations in parks.
It started out so nice.
Yeah, no. And Ingeborg goes into nursing. She deals with the male chauvinism. It's the Rikshospitalet. I'm probably butchering these. I apologize. And she eventually becomes a Jordmor, a midwife. But in Norway, there are two kinds of midwives, actually. There's the ones that I talked about before, where they're just women who've learned how to take care of children. And then the Jordmors were state-sponsored midwives. They were licensed professionals. This was Norway's attempt at taking control of this population boom, because there was infant mortality and all these problems. But just like any government, they woefully underfund and abuse these Jordmors in favor of trying to get more and more people to go to hospital. So each region in Norway would only have one Jordmor, and she would be the official Jordmor for that region. But I don't know if you've seen a map of Norway. It's a lot of rocky fjords and coastline and islands. It's near impossible to get around. There's stories of Jordmors going out in rowboats in the middle of the winter in storms to deliver children, and they were paid so very little, and they had to compete with these unlicensed midwives. And part of their job would be to like try to shut down the midwives, which a lot of them didn't really want to do. But they were the more professional ones, and their livelihood depended on people basically paying them and giving tips and stuff because the government salary was nothing, especially when you have to go out in a damn rowboat. So she sets up in a hotel near her hometown. Her parents actually come back and forth and visit her. But she gets sick of it, sick of being kind of abused by the government to deliver children. And when she gets back to Oslo, she also realizes that this population boom has left a large number of poor people, a large number of widows or out-of-wedlock births. And she's handling, as a midwife, a lot of these births from women who are in really bad straits. And they don't want these children. These children are going to be horrible detriments to their lives.
And just to be really clear, it's hard to talk about this in like a very conscious way.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to make the point that most of these women probably had families already.
Yes.
The right likes to use this talking point of people using abortion for birth control, which does not happen. That's a horrible thing for people to try to weaponize against women. And what they ignore when they do that and they say that is that very often it's women who are in a situation where they already have children, they already have a family, they don't want a child at that time, they can't have a child at that time, their life is in danger. There are a lot of reasons that these women would have been seeking abortions and been in a position where that was the choice that they wanted to make. And Ingeborg being there was part of their being able to make that choice.
Yeah. I mean, Oslo was overcrowded at the time. There was very little housing opportunity. And this is where I believe she's starting to perform abortions because she has the training. She is a midwife. She has sole jurisdiction over a vast area, more than she should be able to deal with. She herself, large family. She saw children die from disease because they couldn't be taken care of by their existing family. And these are people who are on the poor rolls, basically relying on the state. And one of the things that happened is if you were poor and you needed state assistance, you would be bound to the government. You would be denied the right to vote.
Sounds like a situation that some of the far right would love to bring back.
Yeah. But luckily, we also have these feminist groups of nurses and women in general who are pushing for, again, women didn't have the right to vote at this time, but Norway is one of the countries leading that charge in Europe. And one of the things that they used to manipulate that and push the government toward it was the idea of, hey, shouldn't the mother have a vote? It was all about motherhood.
What about us childless dog ladies?
There were schisms within the feminist movement in Norway at the time, and I can't believe I'm saying that phrase like I know what I'm talking about, but I've done way too much research on it. But like, also Ingeborg is growing up at this time when these feminist movements are getting started. Right down the road from her, a famous playwright in Norway, Henrik Ibsen, lived in Grimstad. Ibsen wrote The Doll's House.
Yeah.
The town loved that he had basically worked at an apothecary 4 or 5 shops down from where Ingeborg grew up. You would have been a local hero at the time. Doll's House was about how women at the time were owned economically by their husbands. Women were not allowed to have any property or money or anything like that. And bookending that was a radical feminist, the daughter of the schoolmaster who Ingeborg probably got lessons from, Elizabeth Helmer. She was one of the first female photographers, opened up her own studio, unmarried, and controlled her own finances, and was dealing with this incredibly nuanced, sophisticated technology at the time, photography. And she was just proudly there in town running this innovative photo studio while Ingeborg is growing up. And then I mentioned before that Oslo was named Christiania. It was named because Norway was in a union with Sweden at the time. It was not in control of its own fate.
Was it in a union with Sweden, or was it...
Not like a union like, hey, fight for your dues, let's sing the songs of IWW.
No, I mean, like, was it an equal union of countries?
it was a
gotta
junior...
be real careful about that.
Yeah, no, it was a junior partner in this union. It did not have control of its own destiny. There was a lot of nationalist fervor at the time about gaining independence. And the feminist movement was like, I know how we can trick these men into giving us the vote. Because they need votes in order to have a peaceful overthrow of government. They need political power. So what we're going to do is we're going to name some of our feminist organizations things like Skuld, the Valkyrie in charge of the fates of men in the afterlife, right? They take this Nordic nationalist fervor and name their feminist organizations these badass fucking names.
That is some genius marketing.
And it worked. They gained the right to vote way before most other European countries.
So what you're saying is Planned Parenthood just needs to change their name.
Just go even fucking harder, right? And so that convinces them. And I could go on and on about the feminist movement in Norway for some reason now. But again, this is where Ingeborg grows up.
At what point does Ingeborg move to Bay Ridge?
She emigrated in 1913, naturalized in the 20s. She comes on one of these brand new cruise ships that get developed by the Norwegian American line that are all about transferring immigrants from Norway to America. It becomes a big thing to immigrate. Ingeborg immigrates alone, unmarried, a woman on her own, like a lot of professional Norwegians at the time. Ironically, the captain of the ship that she's on ends up defecting to Nazi Germany. Later
just throw that in there.
It's just a fact I found. There's a lot of tangential facts that I don't know how they'll make it into the book, so I thought I'd mention it here. And she kind of just decides to get out from under the medical profession in Norway, which was chafing, that Jordmor system.
So when she gets to Bay Ridge, does she throw a shingle on her door, Ingeborg, abortionist?
Yeah, actually. She lands at Bush Terminal down in Sunset Park. Amazingly, you just go right up the hill, and that's the nascent Norwegian community of Bay Ridge, because you don't have the highways that separate out Sunset from Bay Ridge.
Robert Moses hasn't
hasn't cut through everything
yet.
And the Finns are already here, the radical Finns. They were inventing all these like socialist forms of handling housing, because housing was a big problem, so they invented the co-op. They invented the co-op in Sunset Park. The first co-op in the entire world is in Sunset Park.
And we have the Finns to thank.
We do. And the Nordisk Tidend, which we mentioned a while back, it was one of the newspapers in the newspaper shop.
Oh, yeah.
The Nordisk Tidend was the Norwegian American newspaper, all the goings-on, and its offices were right in Bush Terminal. It overlooked the docks where all of these immigrants would come in. Ingeborg didn't have to go to Ellis Island. She paid for a second-class ticket. You got off at Bush Terminal, and if you were on, the poorer roster of people on that boat, they would then get a different ferry and ferry you over to Ellis Island to process you. But she was like, no, you're good. Go walk up the hill. Welcome to Bay Ridge.
So at that day and age, how did one open a business performing abortions?
Well, she didn't have a place to stay immediately. She went over to Jersey City to stay with a friend for a little while, who I believe is also a communist, who would let her hang out. But I mentioned the Nordistidens. You open a shop by finding a place to live, and you put in an ad in the paper. And that's one of the places you can find Ingeborg in the record is Ingeborg Rasmussen, her maiden name, Jordmor. She listed herself, I'm a midwife. This is what I charge. Come find me. I'm at this address. And that's how she ran her business when she was in Norway,
It's really interesting then, because we started this episode by talking about the abortionist of Bay Ridge. But what I'm hearing is she was a midwife, and she was providing reproductive health care, and abortion was one of those services.
It was one of those services.
So I think we have to be really careful to not conflate those two things.
Yeah, it's not the only thing she does. One of the things I tried to do very, very hard is to find all of the babies that she delivered. Unfortunately, when I tried to go find Ingeborg's midwife records, the municipal archives just couldn't find them. Lost. All of them. All midwife records.
How very specific.
She must have delivered a massive number. Unfortunately, New York was tried to harass midwives out of existence. There were exposés in newspapers, very famous ones, where undercover journalists would pretend to be mothers in need and ask for abortions, and even if not that, then inspect and catch them in unsanitary tools, things like this. So they were trying to license them out of existence, and it's great that they would inspect them for how sanitary are your utensils. The problem was that a lot of these women were immigrants, and that would be another tick against them, not being able to speak English properly, but those are the clients they're serving, right? And there would be a lot of racism.
Well, and I think it's important to talk about the fact that historically there have been these spheres where women have been conducting business and conducting themselves and teaching women about their bodies and how to manage their reproductive health. As they were trying to professionalize it, it was moved into the sphere of men who had power over the women, who didn't necessarily understand the depth of the historical knowledge, and who were there to take power away from the women who had been providing that service.
And you can't talk about abortion in New York City without talking about African-American midwives at the time who, by and large, because the racist white establishment didn't really want more black people, allowed black midwives to operate in certain respects, but also abused and over-policed them, and then didn't care if people died. But the second a rich white woman would be getting an abortion, it would be scandalous, and they would try to shut down the medical institutions. And the white doctors were dominating abortion at this time. They were performing them, but they were performing them for white women who could afford it. They would be professionalized. They would be behind closed doors, and it would be accepted. There was this huge raid, essentially, in Chicago of abortion providers, medical professionals. We're going to take away their licenses, and it just magically disappears. So there's uneven enforcement. It's a racist and eugenicist kind of way of dealing with abortion in the 1900s. And Ingeborg fills in this gap as someone who's performing abortions for her community, for the people who are also Norwegians in the area, and increasingly, people start learning who she is. These newspaper articles are one of her early brushes with the law, which is unfortunately one of the few places you can find information about her, because a lot of the legal documentation and criminal reports burned in a warehouse fire. There's very little documentation you can find about abortionists in New York that practiced in the 20th century. It's called the Silent Era, not because people weren't doing anything, but because people were trying to avoid prosecution. There is very little written documentation, written record, and the stuff that is there oftentimes was destroyed, and people were trying to escape persecution. So there's a big period before Roe is passed where it's very hard to get any accurate information whatsoever, much less someone like Ingeborg, a random woman, But she was arrested because a woman died. This is, I think, in the 30s. She was a Long Island woman. She drove down to Bay Ridge hours to see Ingeborg. Apparently in the trial, they were like, oh, it was like a word of mouth thing where someone was like, oh, do you know someone? It's like, oh, yeah, there's this woman down in Bay Ridge. She worked for the very beginnings of the visiting nurse service of New York, back when it was the visiting nurse service of Brooklyn and the visiting nurse service of New York. One of the other things I have to get records on is she went to Litch, Long Island College Hospital, to get additional medical licenses in America because people didn't understand. She had her listings in the nursing records, and you could have L for your studied at Litch, and she had R for the Ricks Hospital. No one knew what the hell that was. So she had to get licenses in America, even though she was already a licensed nurse practitioner and probably at the skill of a doctor. Litch at the time was training men how to perform abortions. She had access to those documents.
That story of somebody who comes from another country with all these qualifications has to re-earn them once they get to America is so universal.
Yeah.
In my family, we have my great-grandfather who had to come over and retrain as a pharmacist. And first he came over and he went somewhere that spoke Russian and Yiddish, and he learned Russian. And then he went somewhere where they spoke Russian and English, and that's how he learned English.
Yeah. So this woman comes down from Long Island. I think she already had a child. She comes with her husband. Very, very common at the time. The husband and wife both come together. And the woman was applying chili peppers to herself in an attempt to induce stillbirth.
Oh my God.
And Ingeborg's like, don't do that. Don't.
No.
That's not, no. But there was very little information at the time. And this is also the dawn of contraceptives not being available. A lot of the splits among the feminist groups are, should we focus on contraceptives or should we focus on putting kids into orphanages, things like that? Like, what should we focus on? But this woman really didn't know what to do, and she was desperate, and she was in pain. So this woman is coming down from Long Island. There's a reason also that Ingeborg would be chosen, which is she's Protestant. I'm sure that a Protestant midwife may know about this, and it was true. And Ingeborg might have been known.
As opposed to a Catholic midwife just wouldn't go anywhere near it.
Exactly.
Right.
And a lot of them were very afraid at this period of time to be caught in this, because they're, again, journalists trying to trap people. Midwives are on the way out at this point. And Ingeborg's shameless. I gotta talk about it the way that Ingeborg would want it to be talked about, right? Which is it's blunt. This woman was coming, applying red hot chili peppers to herself, making a danger for herself. She arrives at Ingeborg's house on 92nd Street, and Ingeborg's husband opens the door. Harold. Ingeborg's married, doesn't have kids her whole life. This guy is young, 10 years her junior. Incredibly rare for this point in time.
Go Ingeborg.
Yeah, hell yeah. I mean, but he comes from a large family too. He was born, I believe, in Queens, and he comes from a large family himself, maybe an abusive father who influences the older brother. The older brother has a child out of wedlock and forces the family to take care of this child. The next time you see them in the census records, and you can make up this story in your head, is the mom, Harold, and Harold's younger brother and the out-of-wedlock child appear in the census records, but not the child's father, the older brother, or the dad. Something happens, and they flee. They go to Connecticut. They're out of Queens. They're out of New York City. But you know that whatever that was set something in Harold's mind. And there's trials and tribulations, but eventually he meets Ingeborg, someone else who had a traumatic experience with a large family, and they team up. He's a super. He runs the building on 92nd Street, and they live in the ground floor apartment, and Ingeborg decides to get into the work, in addition to being a Jordmor, of doing colonics. I don't know if people know what that is. That is irrigating colon. And it's a 1900s
That's
thing.
really all we need to say about that.
Yeah. But it requires equipment. It requires a chair with valves and water flow and all of this stuff. But it has to be installed. Direct water line access, and guess who's a super? Guess who gets to install it?
Way to be an ally, Harold.
Yeah, fuck yeah. This could irrigate your colon. It could also be used to assist with medical abortion. She has this perfect alibi. She performs this abortion for this woman. She tells them to come back. Harold gives them tea in the front room. Ingeborg and Harold are entertaining other people in their apartment building when these people arrive. And they back her up in the court.
Amazing.
They back her up. The whole building. It's like a bus driver and all these like working class people. And they're like, yeah, we were hanging out and having tea cakes with Ingeborg. And this lady comes in saying like, oh, I need an abortion. And we saw Ingeborg get up and go, you have to go. We don't do that sort of thing. And, you know, they have to drive back to Long Island. And then this is true. They did come back the next day at night. And we also had tea with Ingeborg that night. And Ingeborg said, why are you back here? I told you to go. And then they left again. But really, you know, she was like, yes, but I need to prepare. Come back tomorrow. Harold hangs out with the husband in the front room, making sure that he's calm and okay. You know, they have jobs. This is a successful midwifery clinic, and they also do abortions, which is part of healthcare and planning. She's also going to people's houses and delivering children, but when people can't handle that, when it's not something that they can do at that time, there are very few options. Contraceptives are hard to find. She also talks about contraceptives. She helps give them out. She's the whole package. But she gets arrested because the woman goes back, has a problem. She dies in the hospital. And I don't even think it's the husband. I think it's one of the investigators investigating the death, which is suspicious. Which a lot of police officers, they would really hard investigate women who died in childbirth to investigate if it was because of an abortion. Like they were looking for this shit.
That's really kind of echoes of a lot of what's happening in some of these red states today where somebody has a miscarriage and they go into the hospital for treatment and they are accused of having an abortion. And now that we no longer have the protections of Roe v. Wade, there are legal consequences to that.
Yeah, it's happened before. Absolutely. They try to outlaw midwives from existence as well because in addition to abortions and contraceptives, midwives would often, or not often, but they would, probably Ingeborg, manipulate the birth records and say that the child was in fact not born. This woman is not a mother, but they would take the child and find them a place for adoption, get them into an orphanage, but the woman would not need to deal with the public accounting of that, or maybe it was an out-of-wedlock child, something that the woman didn't want public. Midwives would be able to find that child a home. With the professionalization of medicine and the fact that doctors are supposed to be doing these behind-the-scenes things because they were doing it, they would really be trying to crack down on midwives. Something like 60 to 70% of the city was using midwives at a certain point in the early 1900s. Ingeborg was there. She was doing it all. It was her sole job. Harold didn't work.
Other than being the super.
Ingeborg was the breadwinner, 100%. She was making the money. And then she gets convicted for that first arrest. She's sentenced to jail. It's overturned on appeal. They were like, the whole apartment building, basically, were in her defense.
That's the kind of solidarity we like to see.
I think she only served maybe like 6 months.
She only served 6 months.
It was pretty bad. But like a lot of midwives got a lot worse. And also Ingeborg was fearless. I believe that her sister died of tuberculosis because in addition to all of this cool stuff she's doing, she's also volunteering at the tuberculosis hospital on North Brother Island. She's taking care of Typhoid Mary, isolated on North Brother Island. She's commuting. I think for some summer she lives over on North Brother Island taking care of tuberculosis patients and she's doing maternity care for people in quarantine wards because I think that she's immune to tuberculosis from when she was a child. You have her on nursing records working at these hospitals for the absolute forgotten of New York City. And what the government is doing and what society is doing to her is just trying to track her down and make sure that she can't do any of these things ever again. And that brings us to the end of Ingeborg's story, where she probably has this long life full of helping people, and she's caught one last time. So she's in her 80s, and she probably could have been a doctor 10 times over by this point in her life. And there's one more complication, not fatal, just had to be hospitalized, and she doesn't have the support networks of hospitals and stuff to help her out. Births have complications.
Well, and one of the reasons someone seeks an abortion may be that their pregnancy is going through complications.
And it's already at risk. The records for that trial burned. I don't have access to them. I don't know exactly what happened there, the one when she was in her 80s.
So out of 50 years, something like that, of performing abortions. She had 2 cases with complications.
That required hospitalization that we know of.
That seems like a pretty good track record.
Amazingly good track record. As far as I know, she kept her midwife license into the 1940s, 50s. I think she must have been one of a couple hundred in the city. And they throw the book at her. Harold had since passed away, which she takes extremely hard, buries him in Greenwood and plants a tree in his memory. Utterly distraught. Justice William B. Grote, who I mentioned in the cold open, this guy really has it out for abortionists. He really has it out for, I think, women in general. He is a Republican who is looking to rise in political power outside of judgeship. He's a Queen's Supreme Court justice. Why the hell is he in Brooklyn?
I was going to say, how did he wind up with jurisdiction?
The woman was in Queens, but Ingeborg's in Brooklyn. The trial is in Brooklyn Supreme Court. I went to the Queen's Library to try to look up Justice Grote's records are there. All of his personal notes. He has notebooks with all of the details on all of his cases. Because you can't normally do that.
Yeah.
You can't move from where they are elected to be. How? What?
An unelected by Brooklynites Queen's judge coming to Brooklyn to prosecute a woman for providing health care to another woman.
Yeah. And fine, okay, there's got to be some notes here. And he has meticulous notes, these little notebooks the size of your palm. And I'm going through them and I'm finding the dates, and the dates for Ingeborg's are all torn out.
Wow.
His schedule, it's not there. It's gone. And then immediately after, he's getting all these commendations from politicians, and he rises up in politics. So I have no idea what's going on with the Honorable William B. Grote. If any of his family or relatives are listening, sorry, this is all I know about it. Hey, if you have more information, send it to me. I'm still writing the book. But yeah, he throws the book at Ingeborg. Ply your stinking trade. It really just lays into her. There's no court documentation for this, burned in a fire. You get just the news articles. And she's too old to be sent to prison. Which I imagine Ingeborg is kind of smiling. Mm-hmm. And they send her to a nursing home, much like the one she stayed at as a young nurse in training in Oslo. To basically just be like, we're going to watch you. You don't get to have your own house. You don't get to have your own home. She's alone. And they just send her out to a nursing home, and that's the last you hear of her in the historic record. I think it's the Norwegian Christian home. Most likely is where they sent her. The records for that don't exist for that period as well. If anyone's listening from there and you have records of Ingeborg, please contact me.
That's really interesting because you've got this story of this woman who it sounds like was very embedded in her community her entire life. You talked about her neighbors giving her an alibi and her performing this trade from her days in Norway through to coming over here. It's interesting that as she grew older and her husband passed away and her network grew smaller, her protection grew more tenuous.
It did. The neighborhood was changing. And the last story I want to give is my story with Ingeborg, which is trying to find her grave. She was buried in Greenwood Cemetery. She is in Greenwood Cemetery with her husband. I looked up that she's there, but I couldn't find her. This was about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, go to Greenwood. And I just wanted a little bit of I wanted to talk to the grave a little bit and just be like, I'm sorry that I'm the only person that seems to have discovered you, and it's got to be me. And I'm hoping telling your story correctly. But I couldn't find that grave. It was 2 hours, 3 hours in the cemetery, and I'm going through every single headstone in the section that I know she's in.
Wow.
No Ingeborg. And I kind of give up. And I'm like, all right, I need to de-stress. And there's birds singing at the edge of this hill, this big yew tree. And there are all these mockingbirds. There are no benches, so I'm just going to go sit under this tree. And so I walk around it, and I'm like, the birds are really pretty. I really like this bird song. It's very nice. I was tired, and I was frustrated as hell. Also, I knew the hill would overlook the Statue of Liberty. It's high up because it's beautiful views in Greenwood. And I go walk around it, and I find her grave is right at the base of this tree, facing away from everybody, not part of the rows. No other graves around. And there on the gravestone, it just says, "In loving memory of my beloved husband, Harold, his wife, Ingeborg." And then at the bottom of the grave in small letters, just the simple sentence, "In God's care." She was religious her whole life. It didn't conflict. It must have drove her to care for people. She was interred on January 10th, 1973, 12 days before Roe v. Wade is decided. She never lives to see abortion legal in this country. And I realized that the yew tree is a symbol of life. It's aged to when she buried Harold. She planted a tree behind her husband's grave. And it's protected that grave for 60, 70 years. And no one's seen it. I encourage you, if you can, to find it. It's beautiful. Someone at the cemetery obviously cares for it still.
So, something interesting about the yew tree. The Japanese used yew leaves for things like diabetes and to induce abortions.
Yeah. I'm tearing up.
I know, this is very emotional.
I've lived with this woman for like 2.5 years. And it seems like she's like the only person that, knows her. And I wanted to wait to write this full story to get all these facts right. I've messed things up when I'm talking, and I know that I've not fully approached this subject matter with some of the gravity that it really needs, and I'm sure I apologize to anyone if I've messed up some stuff. But she's just been part of me for so long, and I can't keep that inside anymore. And I need to kind of let it out a little bit about how amazing Bay Ridge is. The whole apartment building supported her, like the neighborhood supported her, and she's been forgotten. And it's time to let her have her time in the sun and celebrate an amazing medical provider that some people in this neighborhood may not want to talk about, because she did things that no one else was willing to do. She was willing to go against the grain. She was willing to fight the government, spit in its face, essentially, to do what's right.
Well, and I think, to your point, there is a resurgence of that in this neighborhood over the last 6 to 7 years. And there are a lot of people in Bay Ridge who've stood up and said that there are things they believe are a right, and they're not going to let the government get in the way of exercising those rights. And one of the things I think is really interesting is when Roe was overturned and the Dobbs decision came down, there were people in this neighborhood who I spoke with who said they were going to learn how to perform abortions.
Ingeborg smiling. Help people. Going back to the very beginning, where I understand the other viewpoint. I understand having a direct personal experience that leads you to believe the opposite, that this shouldn't be something that you do. But I also don't think that that should get in the way of other people's care. She spent her whole life listening to people in the foyer of her own home, no office, inviting them in while her friends were having tea, and listening to their stories about what they needed, whether it was contraceptives or delivering a child that they couldn't wait to have, or that their family was already too big and there were too many pressures.
Or that there were medical complications.
Absolutely. No one was willing to talk to them, and Ingeborg was. Ingeborg opened that door, and she listened to so many people in so many situations. And I take that to heart, where when someone says they don't agree with abortion, I'll listen to that. What do you need? But if someone does, listen to that. What do you need? Take Ingeborg's story to heart, everybody. That's how we should be conducting ourselves. And that's what Bay Ridge is about. That's been Bay Ridge's history. It's in this neighborhood's character. There's nothing more Bay Ridge than this. I want this neighborhood to be known for someone like Ingeborg. I can't think of a better person to represent this neighborhood. And I'm so happy that she was here. She was a member of the Norwegian Republicans Club. She was active in politics.
She get run out of that right quick today.
Well, that was back when it was a little bit more progressive. There's an article you guys can read on Radio Free Bay Ridge about the history of our local council people from 1900 to 2000 and today, where you can hear about like the rise and fall of our local political clubs and parties. But she was an active member of this community. She was loved. I think it's about time, with everything that's happening nowadays, to remember her and do something. do something like Ingeborg did, whether it's voting, whether it's learning how to take care of yourselves and fighting against oppression. She did that in a country that wasn't hers. She did that for people she did not even know, people who turned around and reported her to the police. She did it anyway.
I think another lesson in this is even if you can't be Ingeborg, be one of her neighbors.
Hell yeah. I don't know how to end this because there really is no ending. We still are dealing with these things today.
You know, that just reminded me, if people are looking for a concrete action they can take to commemorate and support the work that Ingeborg did and the history that our neighborhood has on this issue, Prop 1 is coming up on the election, which is the Equal Rights Amendment for New York State, which would enshrine in our Constitution equality for a wide range of people. And in the face of the national climate on abortion, it is important that we put up every single guardrail we can within the state. And this is a big one.
Protects more than just pregnant people, which is among the people listed in that proposition. Everything after that proposition?
No.
That's an Eric Adams power grab. Please kill all of those. But the first one,
yes,
Equal Rights
one.
Amendment. And you have people like Alec Brooke-Trasmy this election and a lot of local Republicans saying vote no on that, trying to stoke fear about all the horrible intrusions into your life that, such a thing will give. But we've seen historically it's those people who will intrude.
What another concrete action you can take, particularly in respect to Alec Brooke-Trasny, he's up for re-election this year. There is a Democrat running against him, Chris McCrate, who has made women's rights one of the top issues of his campaign.
Yeah, this election is going to be important.
The fight for women's rights and for people's rights is never going to be over. But we've mentioned 2 concrete steps you can take at the ballot box this November to help safeguard those protections and bring Ingeborg's spirit into the present day.
She would really like that. Thank you so much, everyone, for a difficult topic today. It was very difficult for me. It's hard getting all of the words out. Just so many notes that I didn't even reference today because it's in my head.
We mentioned at the beginning how hard Dan's been working on this article, but Dan, you really went above and beyond on this one, and it's such an important topic, so thank you for pouring so much into it.
I take it very, very seriously. If there's any corrections or anything you guys know, please just contact me. I'm still writing. I'm still working on this pretty much nonstop.
You can reach us via DM on social media, or you can reach Dan at dan@radiofreebayridge.org.
If that email is working.
Yeah, if that email's still working.
I'm pretty sure it is. You can also follow the podcast on wherever you get your podcasts. Please subscribe. We're going to be going, about once a month-ish.
And again, consider joining our Patreon. We create this podcast without any funding. We don't take payment. We don't take ads. That's been one of our kind of points since the very beginning. But we do have a Patreon. We are grateful for the support of anybody who chooses to take part in that. Dan has made some really inventive subscription levels. Based around our lives here in Bay Ridge. We'll give you a shout out.
When you become a Patreon, you can send a direct message there and ask how you would want to be credited, if at all. And if you're already one of the few patrons that we do have, please send a message. Let us know if you want us to do a shout out on the webpage or something like that. You can obviously follow us on Facebook, Instagram,
Twitter, Threads.
Oh God, if you want to do Twitter, but you don't have. Twitter is increasingly a trash
I think
fire.
We're kind of, as much as Meta has its own issues, I think we're kind of becoming a meta-first platform.
Yeah, I think we're going a little bit more toward Threads and stuff like. There is a Mastodon. If you want to toot at us, we don't. That would just mean it gets really data nerdy occasionally.
Seems appropriate for Mastodon.
Yeah. And those are the ways to get in touch with us.
Yep.
That's most of it. And the website.
And until next time,
stay free, Bay Ridge.
The other thing is, I think Dan refers to making a woman regular, and I'm like, men are not going to know what that means.
I know. I don't care if men don't know what it means.